live from Tel Aviv. A surprise development out of Europe. NATO has invited Ukraine to its summit next month. A major development amidst repeated calls in the past from Kiev for a no-fly zone to be implemented. Ukraine is not a member of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Now, earlier, Moscow announcing it would drastically reduce its assaults on Kiev and Chernihiv following the latest round of talks between Ukraine and Russia in Istanbul. Turkey's foreign ministry describing today as the most significant progress in talks between the sides so far, almost 5 weeks since the Russian invasion started. Our correspondent, Mary McAuliffe, has this update.
For the 5th time since the war began, Russian and Ukrainian negotiators are meeting for direct talks. And for the 2nd time, Turkey is hosting.
Achieving a ceasefire and peace as soon as possible is to the benefit of everyone. We think we have now entered a period where concrete results need to be obtained from talks.
The Ukrainian president said he's ready to accept a neutral status in a peace deal, but Ukrainians would have the ultimate say in a referendum.
An agreement for security guarantees can only be signed after the ceasefire and the withdrawal of all Russian forces to the compromise line that existed on February 23, 2022. In addition, I want to emphasize the status of the Crimea Peninsula and Sevastopol. Regarding this area, it was bilaterally agreed with Russia to take a break for 15 years and negotiate between us regarding the future status of the region.
The Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation decided to fundamentally buy time, cut back military activity in the direction of Kyiv and Chernihiv to increase mutual trust and create the necessary conditions for further negotiations and achieving the ultimate goal of agreeing and signing the above agreements.
With low hopes for a breakthrough in Turkey, on the ground in Ukraine, the fighting continues. In the southern city of Mykolaiv, a regional administration building was destroyed by Russian missiles just as the talks kicked off. Russian forces are continuing their offensive on the port city of Mariupol. Officials say 5,000 people have been killed in the city since the war began. But as heavy shelling continues, the city remains under Ukrainian control. And Ukrainian forces on Monday declared the liberation of Irpin, a fighting hotspot just northwest of the capital.
Our defenders are advancing in the Kiev region, regaining control over Ukrainian territory. Irpin was liberated. Well done. I am grateful to everyone who worked for this result. The occupiers are being pushed away from Irpin, pushed away from Kiev.
Intelligence assessments believe Russian forces' advance on Kyiv continues to be stalled by Ukrainian defenses. But Russian forces are maintaining their grip on Ukraine while seemingly working to reorganize and reset. On day 34 of the war, despite efforts to reach a deal, the fighting is clearly raging on.
So for more insight, our senior international affairs correspondent Owen Alterman is here in studio. So Owen, in this meeting today in Istanbul, the issue of the status of neutrality was raised and discussed. At the same time, we're hearing that NATO has invited Ukraine to its summit next month. Is this not incongruous? What's being made of this?
Well, you're right. In a sense, it's obviously incongruous. But obviously, nobody knows if this deal is going to get to the finish line. Nobody knows when the deal is going to get to the finish line. And of course, the principle has always been, from NATO's perspective, Benita, that it's up to the Ukrainians to decide what their posture is, right? Ultimately, NATO has an open door policy and Ukraine is free to apply for membership or not. And here they're trying to invite the Ukrainians as a way of reaching out, and I think as a show of support, obviously has a real symbolic meaning. And again, Volodymyr Zelensky has, in a sense, been invited to all sorts of forums, to parliaments around the world. So it makes sense in that regard for the NATO member states to invite the Ukrainian foreign minister, although again, not only him, but also the foreign ministers from those 3 other countries as well.
There are some complicated issues that obviously need to be ironed out when we hear about the talks, although we are hearing some message of good progress, some sense that things are moving forward, depending, of course, on who you speak to. Ukraine wants a referendum, though, on any final agreement with Russia. I want to take a quick listen to what one of the Ukrainian negotiators said and then talk about how realistic that request is. Let's take a listen first.
The implementation of this agreement about security guarantees will follow a certain procedure. Firstly, a referendum for all Ukrainian citizens to give their position on this agreement and how it should be implemented. After that, there will be a ratification by the parliaments of the guarantor countries and the Ukrainian parliament. This is crucial. Therefore, we must have the support of the society before we can consolidate this agreement.
A referendum in this climate, how realistic, Owen?
Well, it would presumably happen once the ceasefire had already been put into place. But you're right, obviously, just on the top of our heads, right? Two big complications. Number one, what about the refugees now scattered in the four corners of the earth, right? A huge percentage of the population. Again, many of them are children who presumably wouldn't be voting in the referendum, but many are women and some men who would presumably have voting rights. So how exactly do you get them to vote? Are they voting abroad? Are they coming back? One major question. And second, maybe the thornier question, Benita, from Ukraine's perspective, Crimea and those parts of the Donbass region that are under Russian control or pro-Russian control are part of Ukraine. These are their citizens. And in principle, those people would presumably be voting in the referendum as well. So how exactly would that be handled? And how would Ukrainians feel about people who, in many cases, certainly in Crimea, are on the other side of the fence or on the other side of the issue, have a different set of allegiances? How would they feel if those people vote in the referendum? And maybe those people wouldn't vote in a Ukrainian referendum for exactly that reason. Obviously complicated. It may well be that depending on the terms of a peace agreement, that the Ukrainian constitution might actually require a referendum. So maybe that's what the Ukrainians are speaking to. I think no less important and potentially very interesting is the idea of parliaments in the so-called guarantor countries having to vote to support this treaty. What exactly are those guarantees supposed to be? And who are those guarantor countries? And how are they going to feel about this? One can certainly understand, though, why exactly the Ukrainians would want this. They want this agreement to have heft, and it's going to have heft and legitimacy if it has the support of their public and if it has support of countries who are going to be asked to give those guarantees, to make commitments. Those countries need to be accepting those commitments. That would be done, as the Ukrainians see it, by those countries' parliaments essentially ratifying a treaty.
And talking of that, it brings us to the next point, which is that Israel is one of the countries that was named as a potential security guarantor. Given what is going on the ground, talk to us about the likely reaction out of Jerusalem on an issue like this.
Yeah, the likely reaction, as I see it, Benita, is that it's going to be completely dead on arrival. I don't see any chance that Israel will offer the kinds of security guarantees that Ukraine might want. Israel simply is not in the business of issuing security guarantees. It's against the entire legacy of Israel's national security doctrine, right? Think about every speech, every day, right? Independence Day, Memorial Day, Holocaust Day, every speech at a military base, right? We defend ourselves by ourselves. The corollary, we defend only ourselves. This country has a lot on its hands as it is, just defending its own borders, defending its own citizens, to be able to take on the obligation, and it has to be an important obligation, right, of offering a security guarantee to Ukraine. As much empathy as people here may feel toward Ukrainian people and Ukraine's situation, hard to see how that's happening. Although, again, we don't know exactly what the Ukrainians are talking about. So maybe if it is some kind of lesser guarantee, maybe there's some way for Israel to participate. But I have to say, I just don't see it.
Certainly a very complicated issue on all fronts. Senior international affairs correspondent Owen Altman, thank you so much for breaking down the latest developments.